for the people who are here in person, if you have a question at any point or just want to sort of branch off on a topic, I'm happy to go in a very informal way. So I guess moving ahead, I thought, as far as an introduction goes, so yeah, what we're going to go through is just a high-level view of what the mining industry is. I know you guys all know this, but sometimes it's good to think about, and talk about, the actual sort of business models behind things that support the mining industry. And I'll talk a bit more about the specific sort of business model that applies to, I guess, my company, which is basically focused in the act that you guys are doing right now. We generate projects. This is basically the act that underpins this contest, but we do it ostensibly to make money, right? So we're professional project generators, but we got to think about how to make money on that thing. That sort of goes down to more practical things. How to generate exploration projects, period. Where do you start? What kind of strategies would you employ? And with some discussion after around tips and resources. So I guess I put this slide together just to talk about the mining industry. But when we're thinking about the mining industry, in my mind, we're talking about an integrated, industrial, pursuit. Basically, the industry's goal is basically to cover all the inputs that are required to find, extract, process, and basically market materials, and of course reclaim and mitigate the disturbed areas. And that, I guess, complexity of the industry has in modern times developed itself into almost complete sectors that have very specific expertise. To have a mine, you need a manufacturing sector to supply the mine with the equipment it needs. You need a power industry to supply the mines and smelters with the power that they need. And ultimately, this requires a multidisciplinary sort of approach. And the industry itself, has developed into a very highly kind of specialized and stratified industry. You think it's hard to explain sometimes when I'm talking to friends and family, people who aren't in the industry. You'll say you're in the mining industry. They'll say, well, how much gold do you mine, right? It's like, well, it's not that simple. It's like, well, aren't you in the mining business? It's like, well, yeah, I'm in the mining business, but I don't actually mine anything, right? And the environmental people that spend their life in their career, same thing. You work at a gold mine, that must be exciting. Do you see a lot of gold? It's like, no, I've never seen it in my life. It's all I do is take water samples all day, right? And so what we're talking about here is mineral exploration, and exploration is sort of a different enterprise than is mining. It's all part of the overall system. But just to break it down, the way I look at it is very simply: explorers are the people who find the mines, right? The developers are the people who build the mines, and oftentimes the developers are different than the ones who produce the mines. Sometimes it takes a particular set of expertise to sort of build new projects and sort of mitigate the risk and get the financing, all the kind of thing that it needs to make a mine. Whereas to operate a mine, that's a different skill set altogether. That's a lot about just organization and scheduling and other things. The producers, these are the guys who actually mine the materials and generally reclaim the land, and ultimately sometimes these aren't the guys who sell the product. There's no sales department usually in any kind of mine head office, but there's certainly many glass towers around the planet who make their money off of selling the product. But all of those things need to get together basically for the mining industry to work. And financing as well. Like Toronto's one of the leading spots in the world for people who supply the money to the mining industry. And each of these different subsets of the industry have very different skill sets. And I just wanted to differentiate that at the start. The business of mining, simply put, elegantly by a shift boss that worked at a mine after we were, trying to grapple with, how the heck do we increase production? We need to do more studies. He just sort of begged and said, "It's simple, guys. All you got to do is put the rocks in the box." That's what it is. And what he meant by that is, that's it. Like, you can make mining as complicated or simple as enterprise as you want, but for him, the whole objective for a producing miner was to get that stuff out of the hole and stick it in that box over there and make as much, as money as you can. And ultimately, if you're in the business of mining, you're all about basically generating cash flow and revenue from the operation. And everybody that you employ in the operation is always looking to find some way to tweak the profits, reduce the dilution, increase the recovery, minimize the costs, and ultimately, the things that expose the producers to, that they have to manage is the supply and demand, basically, for the materials that they produce. If there's a strong demand out there in the global market for the commodity you produce, chances are the prices are high. That's good. If not, the prices are low. But generally, you don't control those kind of things. The only thing the mine can really control is basically its costs and basically the amount of material it supplies. And they can do this many different ways. But basically, that is the enterprise of mining, putting the rocks in the box. The business of exploring, though, is completely sort of different, and it's related but different. But basically, the business of exploring, to my view, is the job of that explorers discover the new deposits for the producers. It sometimes happens that an explorer or a group of explorers actually finds something and develops a deposit and takes it to production. In the process, they basically change their company 3 times, but it's really rare. In general, it's so specialized and segmented in our industry. Generally, there's one group that finds the deposit. Oftentimes, there's another group who develops it, and then there's another one that sells it. So the exploration side of things, it's a different enterprise. It's basically pure R&D. It's no different in some respects than if you were in the drug business. We're not the guys who make the drugs. We're the guys who try and come up with the new drugs and then sell them to the guys who make the drugs, right? But basically, that's the initiative. But it doesn't create any cash flow usually. The value that's created basically gets monetized really only when you can sell the product. And the product in our case isn't tons of copper or cash flow. It's basically new deposits. And it's a risky business. There's a high degree of failure. There's a little infographic on this slide that I just ripped off the internet, but it was they say on 1,000 prospects, 100 merit detailed investigation, 10 lead to drill programs to 1 mine. But bottom line is when you're doing research, expect failure. Not everything's going to be a mine, and so the business is always focused on mitigating that risk and reward. Now, the supply and demand for exploration projects is related, but not directly to the supply and demand for the metal. Like in general, demand for metals is shaped by changing global markets, economic growth, that kind of stuff. Ultimately, population I put in there, but the supply of new deposits is really linked to, I'd say, rates of investment in exploration, but that affects the rates of discovery. So we're not really talking about the supply and demand of metals. We're talking about the supply and demand of new projects. And where the heck does an exploration company get its funding? Like when the industry was less specialized and stratified, I'd say most of the exploration was actually funded by industry. My third point, basically cash flow from production revenue. If you've got a mine that's making money and it's depleting its resources, it makes sense to spend some of that money to replenish those resources and find new deposits and stuff like that. But I'd say in practice, that source has, I would say, gotten smaller as a proportion of what the overall sources of funding are for exploration. Exploration or producing companies, are increasingly very conservative, let's say, with the risks that they will take. And it's because they have a different business model. They view their company as a cash flow situation, and exploration is a cost, and it's a cost that comes off the bottom line every year, which impacts the revenues that these guys are getting, and ultimately their shareholders don't like to see that happen. However, so they have basically effectively outsourced a lot of that exploration to other sources of funding. So I list them here. They're basically the broad ones that I think of as government, industry, and then I just put investment down in general. There's lots of different types. But governments do fund mineral exploration in various ways. Most provincial governments, all provincial governments in Canada, have departments that basically do a number of things to try and encourage investment. They support explorers, provide resources, provide funding for education, research, that sort of thing. Some of them actually provide direct incentives. Our company recently got involved in Nova Scotia, looking at some projects, and basically it's because they approached us and said, if you explore in Nova Scotia, we'll give you 50 cents on the dollar. If you spend $1 to explore in Nova Scotia, we'll give you 50 cents back, which basically seemed like that's a cost advantage to go to that area. But it's all done on their part because they want to encourage the mining industry, which is arguably it might be one of the most important industries we have in the country. I just got back from Vancouver, and one of the keynote speakers was this fellow Rex Murphy, and I'm going to presume that some of you know the guy, but he was a long-time Newfoundland fellow, a long-time fellow on the CBC, and he's since retired. But he got up there and gave a really impassioned speech about the importance of the mining sector in Canada, and how he believes certain governments are working to undermine the role that has in the country. Without getting too political about it, but bottom line is for certain jurisdictions, it's sort of like a base upon which the rest of the economy can sort of grow and flourish, and some governments recognize this more than others. But I put strategic initiatives broadly down there as well. Although I'm not aware of any in the West, but in certain countries, access to minerals is kind of critical for their own survival, whether that be economic or even military. And countries like Japan and Korea, the governments actually directly fund mineral exploration because they really want to make sure that their industries have access to the raw materials to make their electronics and stuff. Some particular countries that don't have the resources themselves, sometimes they can provide a lot of funding, and you need to be sort of on the lookout for that. Industry, we talked about that. It's either cash flow from production revenue. Another one is debt. You could borrow money to explore, but it's not really paired well. The problem with an exploration property is it's pretty hard to secure the debt on the property. The property could be worth billions, or it could be worth zero. And if you spend the loan determining that the property is worth zero, the creditor is not likely going to get his money back. So it doesn't work well. So the other one is just investment, private public investors. And I would say this is the world that I live in, trying to encourage people who are basically more risk tolerant, to basically engage and prosper from the process of exploration, which is inherently, as we said, a very high risk but also high reward sort of activity. The way to do this sustainably is ultimately the reward that people get needs to outweigh the risk. But ultimately, that investment really takes the form of you can either, typically done by selling shares, and you either sell shares in the company, which basically means the would-be investors getting a small piece of the company and all of its enterprises, or you can also attract investment directly by selling maybe bits of the project. And I would say all of the exploration that's funded by investment basically is doing one or the other. It's either selling shares, done through selling shares in the company, or selling shares in the project. So I threw this slide in here, poker analogy. And I guess the problem with exploration, it's a bit like poker, but basically you start the enterprise really with not a lot of info, and the cost is low. The enterprise that you guys are doing as part of this contest, I presume, is done on a fairly thin budget for the most cases. It's your own time, it's your own applied sort of effort, making use of what resources you can afford, and free is good. Free is a lot better than it costs you money. So the cost of entry is pretty low. But each little step as you sort of advance, your hand gets more and more expensive. And I guess like the poker analogy, every time you decide to put more resources into the poker project, it's kind of like getting another card in the hand. If you're going to drill another hole, it's going to give you a bit more information. It could either be good or it could be bad, but it costs you every time you take another card. And the comment in this one was, I think, put together by this guy from BHP, but he says you can raise, hold, or drop out at any stage, but bluffing is not a strategy. You can't really bluff your way out of into a deposit, I guess. But like poker and like any sort of pursuit where there's risk, there for every winner there's losers. So kind of migrating into the project generator business model here, but this slide kind of shows pretty simply the it's different stages of it's got share price on one axis, and then sort of stage of development through the whole mining process. In general, the period with which the share price increased most dramatically is usually in the early stages of exploration. In general, the share price, for basically you go from basically having a project that is worth nothing or little, that basically cost as much as the inputs that you put into it were, and hopefully they were as cheap as possible. And ultimately the discoveries then created something of greater value that you can go on and monetize it. But in general, if you move on through this would be the history for the deposit. Once the deposit's been discovered, and once it's basically been defined, a lot of investment is required. It certainly goes in, but it's all going in to do things like de-risk the project and basically get it closer to being a project that is generating cash flow, and it just trades like an investment that creates cash flow. So basically, the period where you're getting the greatest sort of appreciation of value for your dollar investment in the mining cycle is at the discovery cycle. The problem is it's also the period of the cycle that's the highest risk thing. The highest risk. So, the exploration companies operate in that window, and so does the project generator.
If you consider that you were saying like out of 1,000 projects, 100 might merit investigation, and 10 of those might merit drilling. To get to that peak in the exploration, is that where it merits more drilling, or is that where it's just
question was, linking this continuum back to the chart about, I guess, the stage of the project. I would say, yeah, that's hard to say. Like, I would say the way to think about it is you start at the very west end of this chart, like basically with an early stage sort of concept, with very little information, that sort of thing. And I would say on that chart, you pretty much got to get to that 1 in 1,000 sort of scenario on the other side, to get the maximum value out of this curve, right? So, basically that would be, the one out of 10,000 sort of, claims that results in the one mine that's going to be a deposit. In reality, like, the going to be a deposit basically isn't really known for sure, I would say, until you go through some of the other steps on this curve. But again, there gets to be a point when people know that, certainly this thing has economic characteristics, but it won't be on the first drill hole, but it'd be on enough drill holes that, you sort of start to have a sense for what the resource opportunity is and stuff like that. And I would say, that's sort of the stage where I think you get the biggest share appreciation. Once you start to get to the end of that curve, like in the early days, maybe it could be the first hole. You got a new prospect, nothing was there. Now there's 100 meters of exciting, mineralization that's intersected. People who speculate in the stocks, can speculate as wildly as they like. It could be, as big as the moon, sort of thing, right? But by the time you put more holes in it, you start to be able to better quantify that. And but ultimately, there's kind of a link between the two charts. So I'll talk about the investment model. So we're talking about investment coming into mineral exploration. Basically, we're talking about either the sale of shares or the sale of project interest. Basically, to attract investment, you got to give something up. The traditional junior explorer, typically has a key project, and this is to be I'd say a listed venture thing, have a qualifying property. Basically, you have to have one of the maybe 1,000 projects that look like they have something that's worth doing some test work on, and basically you then, as a general rule, sell shares of ownership in the company to bring some funding into the company. Basically what you end up doing is, what the shareholders end up owning, or the company owns, if they're successful, they're going to spend this money, and they're going to move this, hopefully from the 1 in 1,000 chance up to the deposit. They're going to end up with kind of 100%, the company will have 100% ownership interest in that discovery. That's in the successful story. The opposite sort of end of things is they may have 100% interest in something that's not successful. And so it's a pretty binary outcome, usually for the traditional junior. The project generator, different approach. Generally, project generators don't have a single flagship. They usually have a lot of projects. Their overall objectives is not necessarily to find sort of one deposit. It's basically to have exposure to multiple deposits. Our funding source is a bit more diverse. We basically can fund some of the work through the sale of shares, but in general we seek to get a lot of revenue from other groups, which we'll try to group in the category partners. Basically, those people that would seek to invest directly in the projects that we've got, and the funding that comes back to us, it comes back in the form of cash, shares, royalty, that sort of thing. And the effect is that overall the equity dilution for a project generator is low. So step back, the little infographic at the bottom is traditional junior working towards 100% of a single discovery. Project generator is looking towards a small ownership percentage in a number of multiple discoveries. And really what we're trying to do is it's just a model, and it's a way to structure things to try and maximize the exposure that the shareholders get to to the upside that can come from the discovery process, one presumes if the odds are so stacked against you through this exploration project that basically having, let's say, multiple irons in the fire or multiple sort of lottery tickets, if you want to take that view of it, you've got a higher chance of that discovery success. And at the same time, the cost to you is mitigated. The cost, by selling interest in the project, essentially, if that project, goes forward and is a discovery, you still have a very significant ownership stake in that project. If it goes sour, obviously your ownership interest in it is low, but you actually didn't have to issue, a lot of stock for the company that basically has diluted, the shareholders' the value. So it's kind of a conservative strategy to mitigate the risks of exploration to your shareholders, while basically providing them the same amount of upside.
So when a company partners with you, it gives you shares. Can you sell the shares whenever you want, or are there restrictions on it?
The question is, if a company partners with us and gives us shares as part of a compensation sort of situation, can we sell them? Yeah, in general, yeah. Sometimes there's restrictions on it, and generally, we hold the stock because that gives us another sort of element of upside on the project. Like if a company, another company options a property from us, spends money on the project, and ultimately finds a discovery, we would seek to, like in the arrangements we have with them, try and keep some sort of minority interest in the actual project if we can do it. We certainly like, other sort of things like cash and shares are things that we can use for just sort of operating revenue, I guess, to keep. So if you need operating revenue, then selling the stock sort of makes sense, and we can do that. Yeah.
So if my company just found something and you have some shares, and my price goes up, would you sell it and buy back and the graph runs lower, or would you just
well, I'd say we're certainly not everybody wants to be a trader, but we're sort of not in the business of being sort of stock traders. I think the way we would view it is if your company bought a property from us and the stock went really high, we would be tickled pink, and it would just be a question of I guess knowing, us understanding what the next steps of the project are for you and the company. If we think that you've basically reached the top of the curve, so to speak, on that chart from the last page, we might be inclined to wanna start selling, right? As a good partner would, we would just kind of kick you to the curb and dump the stock out there. But ultimately, if we thought that no, these guys have a long way to go, we would certainly behave like just a regular investor in the company, I guess. So this other chart kind of sums these up a bit more. But traditional junior generally has high shareholder equity dilution, project generator, limited shareholder equity dilution, but we dilute on the property ownership. So instead of giving away half our company to fund a $2 or $3 million drill program, we give away one of the projects. We give away maybe a 50 or 70% interest in one of the projects, so that another group can spend $2 or $3 million on the property. And if that $2 or $3 million moves the value of that property along, we benefit. If that $2 million that's spent doesn't end up moving the value along, we're no further behind. Really, technical. That's a problem. So like with the traditional junior, usually they have a flagship property, and once you've got a flagship property, you certainly have a lot less incentive to drop the project. And in practice, as long as you raise money for your flagship property, the traditional junior is going to just keep going and just keep going. And that might not be the overall, like that might in the long run not be advantageous. And it's probably one of the main reasons why overall, the criticism with exploration, mineral exploration, is it doesn't create value, it destroys value. People can look back in the last couple of mining cycles and say, well, look at all this money that was raised and spent, through the juniors, and there's a handful of deposits that were created that didn't even sort of compense that amount of money. Well, there's reasons, but certainly with the traditional junior, like you say, as long as they're able to raise money, they're going to raise money and they're going to spend money, and it may or may not be ultimately the best decision. Project generator, generally a bit more dispassionate about the property. We got tons of projects. We generate them. We can get very passionate about the pursuit of what we're doing, but in the end, we don't become married to any of them because they're going to be moving along. So in general, it gives you a bit more flexibility. We're not raising money to basically kind of justify our activities. We're, I guess, have more options at our disposal to where we fund and how we do things. Traditional junior, they need to raise money, when they can. So if the market's hot and they like the results, they're going to raise money. If the market's terrible, they still got to raise money. They're going to go under, and sometimes that can completely destroy any value they did create. They could have found a great mine, built things all the way up, and then they get in hard times because the markets are poor and they've got a poor sort of hand, and basically they got to go out and raise money at whatever price they can. Anyways, the project generator ones, if you're not dependent on going to the market for your cash, it gives you some advantages. And I would say in the last few years, the project generators, no one's done well in the exploration sector, but the project generators, they're somewhat more sustainable. There's other things that I didn't put the slide together, but commodity. That's one there. Cato is laughing. That's good, I guess. Commodity is commodity-wise for a traditional junior. Usually, it's on one commodity. Project generators could be exposed to different things. So, gold tanks, and you're a gold company, you got problems. And anyways, I think that. But in the summary, it's like ultimately the traditional junior. The big issue is the shareholder exposed to real strong downside risk. Basically, you could spend all the money on a wonderful project that ends up turning to be not economic, and basically all of the money that was spent on that basically is now worth potentially zero, right? Whereas the project generator is, from the company side, certainly has exposure to the benefit of all of the expenditure on all of those projects with some diversified commodities and so on. And basically, at the end of the day, if those projects end up being shown to be worthless, the value of the individual projects are worthless, but it didn't come really at the same expense to the shareholder of the company. So anyways, so where does this project generator get its money from? And it sort of goes into some of these things we were just talking about. But basically, treasury. We don't have cash flow from our producing mine, so where do we get our income? And basically, we too can sell stock, common shares of the company for money, which we then deploy. We just try to store those dollars a bit more carefully, so that they're not. We don't typically raise as much money, smaller amounts of money, and in general, the money's more intended to cover sort of the operational aspects of the project generation, which would basically be, the research, the cost of acquiring property, and costs associated with doing kind of the earlier stage sort of elements of making these projects marketable. What we don't raise money to is to drill a lot of holes to sort of build a big resource, because we just can't do it, and stick to the model. But the other one is, there is a lot of different, like I said, government grants, different incentives. There's lots of creative things that you can do to get income. The other one is from partners. So when we option a property, there can be payments involved, and or as we mentioned, perhaps there's stock involved in a deal that we've done. And certainly we can use cash received from the sale of project interest. An example for Transition that was just fortuitous, but we optioned the property to a gold property to a company who who had opted to earn an interest in the property, and they actually had pretty good results from the property, but the market they weren't able to, their stock just didn't get high enough for them to justify raising sort of the next phase of money. Anyways, they ended up getting to a pretty desperate straits, and they actually got bought out by a cannabis company last year. And for a time, the way the deal was going, these guys had spent money on the property. They'd sort of advanced things. We'd certainly taken a lot of stock in the company in this deal, and in the end, we were sort of faced, well, probably the option's going to come back to us. Like, we've got the benefit of this work, but probably our stock's not going to be worth anything. Anyways, it turned out after it turned into a cannabis stock, it went up ridiculous, and we ended up selling it all, and it was a bit of a windfall. But essentially, that sale of stock ended up, meaning we certainly didn't need to do any financing for a while, and it was fortuitous, but sale of stock does bring in some revenue. As operating fees, our group in particular, sometimes we stay with the project. Our company has a depth of technical expertise. We got, I guess, about 8 people in general that are working for us, and a lot of them have different experience. But if a property is optioned from us and the group that is acquiring it, needs that support, we can provide it. And in that case, there's potential for the company to collect fees to do that work, which certainly offsets some of our costs and so on if we've got the ability to do it. And then just to understand different types of deals that our group has done, sort of break them out into option and joint ventures, which are simply what probably hopefully the winning contestant of this project might do is generate a project and then basically find someone to come and invest and spend money on it. It'll probably be through something like an option or a joint venture kind of thing. But in that case, instead of selling the thing today for whatever its today value is, you're basically sort of linking the payment to the sort of future value a little bit better. And in general, they start off low. Somebody has the ability to earn maybe 100% interest in the property, but they do that through making sort of staged commitments and payments. So it's a typical option joint venture structure is the winning contestant of this contest. They have an interest in a property, and they'll find a party who may be willing to spend. And it's thought that to be able to fully understand what the opportunity is of this property, you might need to spend let's say a couple $1 million. So you might be able to negotiate a deal where $2 million in order to earn 100% interest in this property, $2 million gets spent, but it's spent sort of stage-wise. Maybe initially we will spend this much in year 1, and we'll do this kind of work, and for giving us the ability to earn in, you would be able to receive a small amount of money, maybe a small amount of stock. And as it gets a bit more advanced, usually, those commitments and expenditures tend to go up. And for us, that's good. You want to attract a partner. You want to make them, whether you're a prospect generator or a prospector. The main thing is you want a customer. You want to make it easy for your customer. In this case, your customer is somebody who's optioning your property. So, find a way to work with them to get you into the product. It's like going to a car dealer, and the car could be worth $50,000. That's a lot, but you could sort of maybe get a little bit further selling that car. And it's like, how about no money down? Anyways, you can make a sale a bit more easier and try to link the purchase more to the needs of the buyer. The third one down there is the strategic alliance. Those are great. if you can get one. But sometimes you can align yourself with a group that has a specific commodity interest, and in those cases, we've been able to do deals where this group would actually provide us funding, sort of like like maybe a government funding sort of thing, but basically funding up front so that you can actually do the work that that is leading towards the generation of the projects and exploration of the projects, and but in general, sort of more as a partner than as a service provider, and I'll just flip ahead there, but sort of an example of a strategic alliance one is one that was successful for us, but we had a second largest platinum producer in South Africa was looking for new opportunities in outside of South Africa, and had a view that this part of the globe built around the mid-continental rift was an area that had perspective for them, but they didn't have the operating team. They didn't really have the knowledge on the ground, but they certainly wanted to see what they could come up with. So they partnered with our group to basically do project generative work, and the objective clearly was that these guys were going to provide funding, and what we were going to do is use that funding to do project generative work to basically identify, acquire, and then explore a whole number of different prospects. And the deal we got was really good in that they certainly paid for all this work, and for any of the projects that we generated, we already had a partner, namely it was going to be them, but the deal was that for every project that we generated that they wanted to invest fully on, basically it was taken up to a fairly advanced stage, and then it would turn into a joint venture where we would each be given an interest, and then we would each have to decide whether or not we wanted to fund or dilute that interest. But anyways, in total in this case, over 5 years, they provided about $4.8 million worth of funding in this area of interest that I've got sort of up on the screen. And overall, there was about 15 projects that we generated. They decided to sort of move forward a bit on 11 of them. But in particular, one of them ended up being a pretty significant discovery at Sunday Lake. And in that case, in our case, we ended up negotiating with these guys to just keeping a 25% free carry on the thing all the way to feasibility. And that's actually proving probably to be a pretty good decision for us. The work that we did ultimately resulted in the discovery of the Sunday Lake intrusion, which is this little area on the map. And we got some of the most significant drill intersections out of South Africa in about 20 years. So the partner was pleased. They had put this money towards this endeavor, and we certainly found a good new project, and everybody was happy. But I get back to the project generator model. This whole enterprise basically cost us nothing. In fact, we actually made money on it all along the process. Like in some respects, like the funding these guys were providing to us, we actually were able to charge some overhead fees and things like that sort of covered the enterprise, and that allowed us to also get involved with other projects. But so today we still have a 25% interest on this thing, and we spent exactly $0 on it. Yeah. So I don't know. So maybe now to get out of the business model, I don't know if any people have questions about the project generator business model. I'm happy to take them and do them later too if you want them. But more particular to this contest, how do you go about generating projects? And this is a lot of my own personal sort of views. But I sort of look at it as it's a creative, generating exploration projects is a creative enterprise, and basically what you're trying to do is research, basically invent, an idea. It starts as an idea that basically is converted into a marketable product that you're trying to sell for a profit. You're not trying to mine. You're not trying to create revenue. It's all about coming up with basically, a marketable product. And in this case, the product is the project. And who are you selling the project? Who are you selling your product to? It's basically, new, exploration. An exploration company looking for a new project, development stage company. Basically, companies that are a little bit higher up in the food chain. So, but before you start, and I know probably a bunch of you already have, and you may well consider these things. These are always good things to keep in mind. But basically, what projects are in demand, right? Like obviously, as you go through time, different specific commodities, gold, base metals, industrial products, they sort of come and go. Ultimately, if you're going to have a marketable project, it's got to be something people want, right? So you have to give that some thought. Who's going to buy it? Who's going to buy your product? Is it going to be a private investor or a junior explorer, mid-sized major mining producer? You need to know what those guys want to buy as best you can. And like I said, where are these projects in demand? Like it could be that certain type of commodity is in real high demand in some area, but another commodity is not needed. And then you got to think about ultimately how much needs to be spent to acquire and then basically market the new project, and think about how much it's going to be worth. Ultimately, you don't want to spend sort of more time and resources than you're likely to receive if you sell the project, right? So you've got to kind of balance, I guess, all of these few things. Thinking about supply and demand, there's lots of examples for this thing, but let's just look at copper, for example. Here's a chart. Not where I pulled this one, but I think it was this from this report by this Hamish Sampson fellow. But he's got some prediction about what production is going to look like from basically known and existing copper deposits in different jurisdictions moving forward. He's got it into 2035, and he's got this other line out there that's demand. Now, no one can really see the future, but these forecasts are based on presumptions about just broad trends and the way the economy is moving. People presume that we're going to be moving towards maybe more energy efficient economies and things like that, and there's lots of elements that sort of get caught up in that type of forward thinking. But they certainly all involve copper. But on the supply side, there are only so many currently known and producing deposits, and these guys have looked in depth to see what the capacity these things have to produce moving forward and expand, and ultimately there's a gap, and that gap has to be filled by mineral exploration. And in particular, in the case of copper, I've heard a couple anecdotal things. First of all, apparently in the next 50 years, they predict that more copper than has ever been produced historically in the history of humanity needs to be produced to meet this forecasted demand. Yet, one might think that, geez, that might be challenging. Like of all the mining commodities, copper is one of the big ones. It's certainly the biggest of the base metals, and it's going to be. Many people think it's going to be challenging. And what's happened in the last couple of decades is, my belief is that the copper producers and investment really hasn't gone any distance to come close to filling that pipeline. So if you believe, if you think about those things and you have that sort of perspective, people think that they're going to need some new deposits at some point, and somebody's got to find them. My own view is clearly at this point they're actually not looking at things that are very early stage. So you might use that sort of market sort of view and study to surmise that geez, there could be a real high demand for copper projects in the future. As opposed to asbestos. There's a commodity that everybody used to be, but pretty much banned. And you could find a great asbestos deposit somewhere. It could be fantastic, but who's going to want to buy it? So you got to think about supply and demand for the projects, not so much the metal, but the project. So in this case, the future demand for the commodity might be driving it should be driving a near-term demand for the projects. Sometimes there's a disjoint.
Yeah, so you think the demand for copper projects will go up before the copper price goes up?
No, it'll be the opposite. Unfortunately, it should be that way. But in order to meet, but the system it's not a perfect system. What will happen is that the price of copper, this supply gap will become more and more of a concern and crisis that is going to drive the copper price up, so high, and at a point that's probably too late, to actually fill the supply gap. Then, then there'll be, there'll be a rush to some of these earlier stage projects, and unfortunately, probably they'll end up overpaying for projects that that they could have bought 10 years ago for who, but not for us. Like in our business, that's when we're wringing our hands. It's like, oh, an early stage copper project. It didn't cost us anything. Could be worth a lot of money. But then, also knowing what stage a project will be in demand, like, in terms of, non-producing mines, you've got exploration projects which could be, pretty much at the concept stage. There's a theory and an area or something. Maybe no hard data, but to early stage, maybe you've got some promising indications in the ground, maybe a drill intersection or something. Or you're looking for advanced, and in general, the more de-risked an exploration property is, generally the more valuable it is. And a lot of people, if you're looking at producers and things like that, there often is certainly in recent years a real interest in getting things at that stage. But that's the market we're in now. In a more bullish market, there might be more demand for some of these early stage projects, right? Bottom line is, if there isn't a lot of people interested in conceptual kind of early stage projects, your odds of finding a customer for your product are low. You have to consider, how much effort do I put into this, right? And the value might be low. And back to that point, I say future demand for production does not always translate into present demand for exploration stage projects. So we can look at this forward curve and predict things. But another example is saying, I'll just throw out the case for cobalt, and the slide and infographics I have don't make a heck of a lot of sense. But basically, tied to this sort of view that electric vehicles are going to be the way forward. People have looked at forward-looking projections for batteries, and it sort of translates. By gosh, in order to make these batteries, they've got to quadruple the world's supply of cobalt. And where is the supply going to come from? And with the case of cobalt, the concern is that right now 60% of all that stuff is coming from the DRC in Africa. It's just one sort of geographical area. What if you're a Chinese battery manufacturer, or part of Boston Power or something like that? You can't get this product. How wheels of industry are going to fall apart. Right? So basically, there's a lot of interest, and what this did is in the last year in particular, it fueled just a rush to cobalt stuff. And my anecdote around this is, I spent a lot of time working up in northeastern Ontario and the Abitibi and around cobalt and halite. There's over $150 million worth of flow-through money raised to go back and revisit that area, which was known for over 100 years for its silver. But these narrow silver veins in this area, pretty much played out by modern standards, also have a lot of cobalt. And there was a time, it's still going on actually. I think it's still hot enough. But if you had even a claim that had nothing on it, that was somewhere in the cobalt embayment, somebody was going to buy it from you. They're going to pay you surprising amount of money for it. Because previously, prior to this sort of view of the forward price of cobalt, that stuff was really cheap. So I guess if you were able to foresee this kind of thing, and you were able to basically, sort of focus your activities in the old sort of cobalt camp, you may have some very marketable properties, that don't even have to have the same sort of level of quality that you might in another commodity to go after. So it's just talking about supply and demand, but is supply and demand really for the projects? And I guess the cobalt thing really shows it up. The demand actually for the metal isn't here yet. It's going to be kicking in it's coming, but a few more years. And whether or not how this all plays out still remains pretty speculative in my mind. Put this slide out here. So, other considerations to the project generator is you've looked at some basic things about commodity and supply and demand for that kind of stuff in the projects. Is where should you look? And this chart sort of matches again elements of the rubric that you put together for the competition. Ultimately, you need to consider these three sort of tenets there. Ultimately, you really can't control. You can really only control one of them, or let's say we as geoscientists can sort of control one of them, and that would be applying our knowledge and understanding to learning as much solid information we can about the deposit models, tectonic setting, favorable geology. That's really what we need to apply ourselves. But before we do it, we do have to give consideration to things like the social, political aspects and economic. And in the rubric for the contest, there's certainly points assigned to consideration around each of these things. Social, political, if you are presenting a project, it behooves you to be able to answer, some questions about, things that, broadly, across the boundary between, social license and political license. But basically, can you access the territory, to do work on the property? If you find something, is the government legislation going to allow you to mine there? Obviously, it might be difficult if you're right next to the park. Like, it may be possible for you to identify an opportunity. It might even be possible for you to stake claims, but certain circumstances might be, make it really difficult for you to actually move it forward. And that basically, your prospective customer for this thing is going to be thinking about that. They're going to ask the questions. So it behooves you to consider things like, who are the First Nations groups that may have identified rights or may have other claims. What's the circumstances with the community? What kind of industries do they have? If you I live in southern Ontario, and there's great geological perspectiveness throughout the central sedimentary belt and so on. But some of these things are like in Muskoka or in places north of Kingston, and people have cottages. What's that?
In Muskoka, where cottages are?
Yeah, cottage country. Yeah, and you may have something that doesn't impinge on anybody's cottage property, but they just don't like it. They don't want it anywhere near the area. So you kind of have to consider those sorts of things. Attitudes towards mining. When I lived in Timmins, right in the middle of the Gillies Lake Park, which was it's like in High Park here in Toronto. Guys, we're basically drilling through the summer and winter, right in the middle of the park. And people be taking their dogs for a walk, and the kids, and watching the diamond drilling going on. I don't know if you could pull that off in High Park. People would be upset. Economic, I guess, you got to think about can it be financed? I guess, what kind of infrastructure is there? You could have a great idea, and this is one of the other rubrics, but what economic factors have you considered when you've chosen this project? If it's 200 meters from a road or power, and it's the kind of project that needs good transportation and power supply, this obviously is going to could be an economic obstacle, right? If your topography, if you're at the some of these gold deposits in the Gold Triangle, if you're sort of at the top of the toothiest mountain in the range, surrounded by glaciers, that may also present some challenges. So beyond the geology, you need to kind of give some consideration to those factors. Okay, so moving on from some of that, back to the just target selection stuff. In general, I think a good project sort of comes together, so to speak. When you can get information coming from these different sort of sources. Ultimately, there's when it comes to the technical merits of part of this competition, you've got to be giving consideration to the geology and geochemistry. Basically, what are the rocks that are there? How can we assess? How can those rocks be interpreted so that they can be assessed for an economic deposit? The proximity to mineralization, alteration, structure, that sort of stuff. Have you considered geophysics? What kind of magnetic? Is there data out there, whether it be magnetic conductivity, that sort of stuff that can corroborate your theory that there is some sort of a prospective target area. And then the economic factor, again, going back to the rubric again, is that is it something that you could exploit? There's how deep is it? What would you need to think about? I guess there could be fantastic deposits sitting at 2 kilometers below surface, but the question ultimately is who cares, because it might be too. There's never. But anyway, it sort of translates down for you guys into a broad division of labor, which is, for this thing, probably mostly desktop studies. And desktop studies basically includes a review of geological data. And I note on the site that you guys have, actually, like you say, a growing list of resources on the contest site that gives access to different provincial geoscience groups, and some of these guys have these compilations accessible online that you can browse to find out information about the geology, locations where there's mineral occurrences, accessing information about historical work. So a lot of the compilation at a high level has been done by most of those jurisdictions on those sites. But you also need to have a look into property ownership and research property ownership. And again, there are online resources for most of the provinces and territories, or I guess all of them, that you can review, claim status, but also investigate private land ownership and land forfeitures and things like that, which I'll talk about a bit more. Remote sensing data, there's lots of, there are a number of websites that will allow you to download free, aerial imagery and hyperspectral images if you've got the software to sort of manage it. And if you don't, you might be able to find, reports and things that cover the areas that you're interested in. Airborne geophysics, again, there's a lot of stuff that's available for free online through the government surveys. If you delve into assessment work that has been filed, you may also be able to gain access to data, but certainly maps that can give you different bits of information. But depending on what your commodity is looking for, things like conductivity, magnetics, gravity, lidar, which is can be really helpful to do different things. If you're looking for a base metal project that's composed of minerals can be conductive, gosh, a conductivity survey is a real helpful tool. If you're looking for a gold project that where the actual economic minerals don't have a really very very obvious direct association with some kind of method. Things like magnetics and conductivity can help you with structures, but things like LiDAR, which is looking at real detailed digital elevation models, can really highlight joint structures and patterns and things like that can help you see some structures. And geochemistry is lots of information out there, usually provincially or federally, for lake and stream sediment information. Things like soil and till and stuff like that. Sometimes you got to dig a bit deeper. But all of that stuff, I think, is mostly available online. And if not, the other place to go is to the various sort of geoscience resources that you have. At U of T, I'm sure they have a lot of information that can be accessed at the library. The actual geoscience offices, often have stuff that's not online. And actually, just making use of the some of the geoscience groups. Each in Ontario, we've got I think 6 offices, and each is staffed by a resident geologist. And we would love to hear from any of you who are involved in this competition, who's looking at a project in Ontario. Don't call him if you've got one in Saskatchewan, but if you've got one in Ontario, you may also get all of his resources. He will start looking for stuff for you and provide you with data, and that's basically what he's paid to do. So you make use of it. But then the other one is on the ground, and I would say for the purpose of this contest, maybe not so useful. We are in January in Canada. Some people might be from a place where you can get out there, but ultimately, from a project generation standpoint, getting out in the field is the best way to go. And if you have the ability to get out into areas that you have interest in, it's certainly in my mind, as almost more utilitarian than the desktop stuff, because you can get so much information just from immersing yourself in the field, understanding the geology a little bit better, but just actually getting out there also brings you in contact with people who have knowledge and expertise, and a lot of time it's these relationships that sort of lead into things, which I think leads me to what I'm hoping is kind of a humorous thing here. But I've tried to break down what I would call the generative strategies with kind of cutesy little names, but it's kind of inspired by these 2 clowns on the side, which are called On the Bench. These are two sort of West Coast guys that they're into hockey, not project generation, but all the hockey moves that are out there, they've got some stupid name for it. So like if you're going to block a shot, they call it the dead meat slide or something like this, and they go out and they block the shot and stuff like that. But I tried to do the same thing here and break it down into the Collins categories. So basically, there's the one I call the dumpster diver, and it doesn't sound too flattering, but I would broadly group it into the category of data mining. And basically by that is you're trying to access and make use of existing historical information. In times prior to the internet age, sometimes this literally meant you got to find the old maps, the old files, the old records, and sometimes these are often cast out in an old dumpster somewhere. But if you can actually gain access to those records and dig into them, oftentimes a good project is generated. And essentially, you're kind of doing the same process when you're making use, in my own mind, of the online data sources. All of the work that people have done historically that have been relegated to the trash heaps of time, from a project here and a project there, thankfully they've been collected in the repositories of basically, the mining resource libraries and I shouldn't say they're dumpsters. That's a horrible thing to say, but the online data sources. And essentially, I think a lot of people probably in this project that's probably the approach they're going to go. They're going to try and access what information they can, and they're going to sort of go through it looking for for things that seem interesting to them. I'll introduce the second one. I'd call it and they're in no particular order, but I'll call it the ambulance chaser. Totally different strategy, and could win this competition. I don't know. Ultimately, you're trying to come up with the best project. It could be, certainly one of the rubrics is data. You certainly need to look at the data for a project and basically try and sort of put it together in a way that is compelling to the judges. But it doesn't necessarily mean that approach is going to create the best project, right? Because there's another rubric for that one. But ambulance chaser is a good strategy, and it's one that a lot of people use, and it does come up sometimes with very marketable projects. And it's very simple. But basically, is there opportunity to acquire ground near a new discovery or an emerging area? And there are periods in time, usually that follow a pretty exciting discovery, that people make out like bandits following this strategy. The person who stakes the ground that's contiguous with the big discovery oftentimes gets a very valuable return on his effort, his or her effort and investment. And then the person who tacks onto that person and that person. But in general, if you look at where are other groups exploring, sometimes those can be the most they're the most competitive places. Generally, if you're late to the accident or the opportunity, the chances are you're not going to have too much activity. But if you've got your ear to the ground and you're sort of aware of things, sometimes following up on an early report or something like that, and applying your energies before anybody else does might actually get a good project for you.
If someone has a company that finds something interesting, why would they try to acquire all the ground credit before they make their discovery?
Well, there's sort of to what extent, right? Like when I think of there was a big rush that happened up in the Northwest Territories in the 90s when the Lac de Gras diamonds were discovered. And basically, diamonds, as far as I know, are focused in these fairly discrete, sort of formations, these kimberlite bodies. They're not the kind of deposit that lend themselves to kind of district scale formations and stuff like that. Nevertheless, when the first sort of diamondiferous kimberlites were found up in the territories, it precipitated a massive sort of staking rush that spread out from that thing like crazy. And basically at that time, if there was any available ground in a certain area, it was all and it had some sort of a maybe interesting magnetic feature. It was valuable. People were going to option it. People were going to buy it. People were going to move forward with it just because they knew that there was a real interest to invest in that area, sort of on the backs of this successful discovery.
And at that time, some people were just touching flight sites.
Yeah, well, actually, that's right. Like there's not too many jurisdictions now where you actually have to physically go and stake. But yeah, in the modern age, why is it after a discovery the entire sort of district stake? Go through and have a look. You'll see, like, there's limits. People, the discoverers or the people who have the property, one presumes, are going to try and make sure that they have all the ground that they want secured. But maybe they're not thinking about, from their perspective, it's kind of like, well, we've got the best part. And maybe they do, but that doesn't mean that the guys beside them couldn't acquire it and then maybe sell it to that very company or maybe a different one. So. It's true. That's true. Sorry, a comment from the audience is that people's view on that does change through time, and like you said, there's sometimes a lot of pessimism about the discovery. I don't know. it's just something to watch. Like for myself, I tend to follow these things, and what I've seen many times is that this approach actually works maybe better than the dumpster diver sometimes, at least financially. There's another one. I'll call it the vulture. And the vulture is kind of related to the ambulance chaser, but kind of coming at the other end of the spectrum. He's coming for the scavenged pieces. It doesn't sound too attractive, but I gotta say, it's a good way. It's a good way to get projects. But but to do it, really, you need to learn about land tenure issues, is what it is. And basically, what I mean by the vulture is look to be the first to acquire key ground as it comes open. So there may be an opportunity out there that already has a defined opportunity on it based on the historical information, all that kind of stuff. But it's been sitting dormant. And it's conceivable that even though a considerable amount of money has been spent on that property, that it actually can come open and you can stake it online for $30, on any one of these things, or go and stake it. But to do it, you instead of paying so much attention to maybe the sort of the geoscientific merits, you're really looking for more opportunity. Another variant on the vulture is basically being Johnny on the spot to gain access and act on new data. Another one is a report could come out from research that was done maybe in the public domain by the government or something, and information on that report could actually it's new that no one's ever seen before, and some of that information actually could be interpreted if you're quick in such a way that allows you to be the first basically to get it. So the strategy really employs knowing when things are likely to come open for staking. Maybe there's forfeiture issues. New data is coming out. Basically, it's being more of someone who's tracking things. This would be good for someone who's obsessive compulsive to basically, have a list of all of these things that they constantly sort of monitor and check, or set up key reminders through the year to go and look. In Ontario, if ground or mining lands are going to be returned to the Crown and basically open for staking, they go through this thing called the Gazette. And the Gazette is an online thing that comes out every month. But in the month of May, they put all the mining forfeitures in the Gazette, and they tell you about 15 days ahead, which areas are going to come open. I can't help it, but I look every year, and every year you'd be shocked. It's like, oh my God, the other half of the Red Lake mine is coming open on June 1st. Oh my God, it's right next to a producing mine. How is it possible that can ever even happen?
Yeah, right.
June 1st every year, yeah. And but you got all. Like if you're looking at other jurisdictions, you might want to check the Gazette in New Brunswick or Fredericton or whatever. And the other cases, there's sometimes things like, it maybe doesn't apply. You need some resources, but there's things like sheriff sales, bankruptcy sales, things like that you can sort of keep your eye open for, and sometimes you can get projects that can have a high value for cheap. But you're kind of the scavenger. That's why I call it the vulture. There's Mr. Popular. I like Mr. Popular, or I don't know if I am, but basically get out there and network, engage with prospectors, talk to the old timers, and listen to their stories, because there is a lot of knowledge that's out there, and people in general are sort of interested. If you're interested, and these sort of relationships sort of build over time, and sometimes you can get come up with some pretty good project opportunities. Another one I kept coming up with them, and I ran up with this one called the Bleeding Edge. And basically, this one would be can you beat the pack to apply some concept to a new area that is not seen previous success. And in this category, maybe you're the first to gain access to a new area afforded by infrastructure or political change kind of thing, right? So, on a global perspective, there's lots of jurisdictions that have fantastic deposits, but for the sort of economic and political sort of risk element, no one's touching them with a 10-foot pole. But new election comes through, and new mineral policy comes open, and all of a sudden, that risk element is reduced, and you can be in there. On a more local scale here in Ontario, some areas of the country, many areas of the country, have geological prospectivity, but they're just difficult to work. They've been hard to access, which basically, deters people from going there and spending a lot of effort, sort of looking for new opportunities. And, one suggestion is for you guys is to check, if you're looking at Ontario, get on the Mineral of Natural Resources and Forestry site, MRDF. These guys have maps which show for the different parts of the country where there's forestry plans, what the plans are for cutting new areas and roads. And in Ontario, the forestry industry has done, our efforts a great service in that they provided, access to a lot of new areas. But, for example, there may be a prospective belt that, has an economic producing mine on it that people have explored, so far, and maybe it went undercover or something. I don't know if that applies in the Hemlo area, but on the other side of the river from that is terrain that it's just been really difficult. No one's ever really been able to get in there it's been hard to bring a drill in or heavy equipment or something. But if you check this plan, you can tell which areas are coming due. Essentially, these are just some general ones, but I'm gonna throw a few examples out there that are things that we did in Transition Metals, and I thought it would be fun to maybe talk a bit about which categories of my college categories have been employed in some of these things, and I'm trying to give people some just ideas on different ways to go with this competition, right? So here's an example. And I'll see if anybody wants to category. But here's one called Saturday Night. So I think I told you earlier about a discovery that we made at Sunday Lake. Bit of background on this whole process. We were engaged in the area. We had the strategic alliance with this other partner. We were looking for a particular type of intrusion in the right kind of environment. We built up a pretty good sort of database of information. Most of it coming from public domain sources that you guys could get as well. But basically, we had an idea. But the thing that sort of stands out in these things is we knew that there are some major structures in the area, and wherever you get these funny mag patterns, there seems to be interesting geology. Basically, what these things are interesting rift intrusions that are coming up through older Archean and Proterozoic rocks. Here, it's all Archean. But basically, it occurs in sort of dilatant sort of structures in and around some of the major fault systems in the area. And I guess an interesting aspect of these things is we learned that they have this characteristic strong negative magnetic signature. They're really magnetic rocks, but they actually came in at a time where it's I believe the Earth's magnetic polarity was reversed, and as a consequence, they have a distinct signature. And so, we knew that these things were interesting targets. The backdrop I'm showing here is I think total field mag, and there's kind of a white area that's there. And essentially, the total field mag product that I'm looking for is public domain, government airborne mag data that was there, but it was actually flown in two surveys. There was one survey that went this way to the east, and there was another survey that went that way. And there was this like pie-shaped piece in here that we just didn't have any data. And so we learned, through the public register of surveys going on, that the OGS was actually, they'd gone through this process of buying geophysical data and flying geophysical, but they actually decided to fly some of these infill areas, and that they were going to release this data at the upcoming Thunder Bay Northwestern Mines conference there, right? At the WAPA, at 9 a.m. And so it's like, okay, we're interested in this data. Turns out, we can actually get it. The earliest we can get it is right at 9 o'clock, and it's going online. But we actually, we wanted it. We were in Sudbury, so we actually had a guy, there, right at the office, taking the disk and dumping it in the computer to see what we can find as quick as we can. And, oops, I got a big star on it. Well, it suffices to say that underneath this star, which is obscuring this sort of the feature, there was one right there. And by about 11:30 that day, we had it staked. And we ended to go on to have a look at it. We ended up doing geophysical work on it. We ended up even drilling a drill hole, which actually, proved it to be a newly discovered, PGM mineralized intrusion in the 25 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. And got a good intersection out of it. So so I guess going back, what elements of the Collins categories here apply? I gotta think it's kind of a combination between being the dumpster diver and the vulture. Namely, we certainly had, we knew what we were looking for, and we were making use of all the public data that's available. We certainly put these compilations together, but I guess the way we got it was really being, the first to try and acquire the data, like, just to descend on that stuff as soon as it came out and act on it. So these publications are coming out all the time. Well, not all the time, but periodically. And I certainly know that in Ontario, there were some new publications that were put out just in December. And I don't know if everybody in the industry, was intently looking at these things or thinking about eating turkey. I don't know which one, but whoever sort of pours through these things and is able to glean onto something that might be useful to them, might allow them to come up with an idea. There's another example. This project, is still ongoing, but we call it Elephant Head, and I was kind of scrambling. I wish I put some better images, but kind of in a regional scale. Here's Timmins. These sort of dashed lines are up there, kind of the major breaks there. That's the Destor Porcupine Fault down in Kirkland Lake. Excuse me, an interpretation where the Cadillac Larder break may continue, and down in the very sort of lower left hand of the figure near Gogama is a kind of a belt of rocks there. It's called the Rideout Structure, and there's a very significant discovery that's come out of this area recently called the Cote Lake, which a junior called Trelawney basically discovered, and then ultimately did what they sold it to IAMGOLD for a pretty good price. But we thought, well, let's look down in this area here and see if there's anything around there. But I guess we simply went in and we reviewed information that's available on the OGS Earth database. We certainly have our own database and software that we can sort of play with that. But basically, that was it. And we identified that, geez, there is, at the time, it's hard to find an unstaked, for the people in the comments, it's kind of hard sometimes to find, a good unstaked, gold occurrence or something like that, because a lot of them were staked, but there was a couple down there that weren't staked, and I was like, why the heck, that's funny, it's kind of on the right trend, there's areas there that are open for stakes. We started looking into it, and it looked interesting, but looking at where it was one of these areas that had been really hard to access before. Like, there wasn't any place where you could even put a helicopter down, in this area, probably for 5 or 10 kilometers. Like, you could put a boat in from the Elephant Head Lake and go up the Elephant Head River, pulling over beaver dams and stuff like that. But, there's not as many voyageurs out there as there used to be. It was kind of deterring people from going in. But we found out from looking at the forestry maps, holy cow, they just cut that. They just cut that this spring. Let's get out there and have water. So kind of on spec, we talked to some, this was before map staking, we talked to some guys going, oh yeah, you can get in there, no problem. So they got in and staked a couple of claims around there, and we went in as soon as we could. And boy, what was shown in the OGS database really understated what was there. A couple of discretionary occurrences, not much information really provided about it. Some skinny gold veins in granite, and we sort of went down and had a look at it. But there were the major diggings going on there. It seems that somebody in the 30s was back there, and they had opened up major trenches and excavations and pits and diggings on at least one of these showings, and we were getting some really good values back on this thing, and so we did a first pass. We did some programs of prospecting, mapping, soil sampling, and basically we came to a conclusion that the property has it's not only a long strike from Cote's property, it's actually got some similarities to that sort of thing. And in the end, we ended up optioning it to guess who? IM Gold. So going back to this thing, what elements sort of have applied there? I think there's a bit of bleeding edge because we were maybe the first. I don't know if it's the right term, but the first to gain access to there was this new access that was let in there. It's probably why people hadn't been in there before. But we were also sort of giving good consideration to the marketability of it. Like we knew that it was kind of in an area where other people were investing heavily. And it's just an idea. But that and here's another one. Totally different area. It's got very little to do with geoscience research, but this is in Sudbury. Glencore has been working for some time, taking these two projects to an advanced stage of feasibility. They've spent several $100 million on this process. They've got a feasibility study in place that suggests they can put these two VMS deposits into production. One's called Arrington, the other one's called Vermilion. And by looking and doing some research about the property ownership status in this particular area, it became apparent that they actually don't own some of the up-dip extension of that deposit, and that those mineral rights could be secured just by simply staking. And basically that's what we did. So for the people who are maybe looking at project generative activities and trying to find some place where they can get some open ground, you have to pay attention to what the property ownership sort of situation is and what your rights are. In Canada and particularly Ontario, private landowners may or may not have mining rights, and you can do some further investigation to find out. But not everybody who is engaged in sort of the mining, the project generative enterprise is really savvy in those areas. So there are resources that you can go to find out about the status of those things. The online claims database that is available through the Ontario Department of Mines basically shows you which claims which areas are open for staking and which areas are not for the most part. But don't trust it. Is all I can say. Is that I think there's a lot of error on it and so on. But there's additional things that you can do to go and find out. Basically, the Ontario there's an Ontario Land Registry database that you can gain access to, and you can find out all sorts of interesting things about it, down to subdivided lots and ownership and things like that. If you want to have a look at, and other things too, like areas under lakes sometimes are funny. Like in general, you can stake claims underneath lakes. In some cases, the lakes are privately owned. But again, sometimes the mining rates under those lakes are different. There's been a number of kind of deposits and things like that sort of found just from people sort of going through that. So I'd say this is just another sort of approach or style to coming up with a project that it's kind of like the vulture, I guess. Yeah, just kind of clicking ahead there. I think this is pretty much my last slide, but I would like to be able to provide you with links and stuff to some of these things. I note that on the NextGen site there already is a number of links provided to, for the most part, the provincial geoscience resources that are there. But federal and provincial geological surveys have information across the country. It's not restricted to Canada, so there's a lot of other information that's out there depending on the region. Historical records of work, many of which can be linked in some cases to the data that they've got on the online geoscience atlases, but depending on where you're working, that may not be complete. And what I would say in that case is, see if you can find other resources. In Ontario, it could be challenging, but in Kirkland Lake, for example, they have a fairly vast library of stuff from the turn of the last century. That much of it is digital, and it contains a lot of archived information that go back that is not online. But they actually had a fire about a year ago, and I'm not too sure whether the Kirkland one's open. New studies and publications of data. I know if you go online to the OGS, the Geological Survey site, they certainly will provide a list of all of the new publications and data that they're releasing. They usually also post when the next release is going to be coming out. And I'm not aware of anything's coming out in the time frame between now and the conference, but it's worth checking. Certainly worth checking their most recent set of recommendations if you hadn't. Other government agencies, I sort of touched on the Ministry of Natural Resources, federal and provincial. These guys, give you information about other land use activities that could impact or have an influence on your project. Land registry offices in general can be found to find real detailed information about land ownership. NASA, other sources of remote sensing. There's a lot of imagery and stuff that can be downloaded for free. But maybe the place to get good hyperspectral images of your project area are not the OGS. It's some other agency. And academic sources, university publications, research papers, theses, geoscience conferences, academic posters, presentations. These are good sources. People who engage in these things for research, are usually quite engaged with what they're doing and are at the leading edge of this new data. And sometimes takes some time for that to get sort of disseminated out to the whole industry. And if you have close ties to that sort of thing, they are sort of leading the way. And so that's sort of all I came up with, unfortunately, for my tips and resources for you here. Very general stuff, but Jamal, I'll try to provide you some links and things like that can possibly be put up on the site for things that I think would be helpful.
What do you think about full technical reports on CDAR for projects?
Whole technical reports on CDAR fill in the gaps sometimes. Like you may want to know why is it that this is maybe come open or whatever. And it certainly fills in the gaps, because on SEDAR, if it it can sort of fill in the gaps about things like a lot of times you say, well, why did somebody leave that area? Why did they stop exploring there? And usually in the public record, unfortunately, the last days of a project are usually the most poorly recorded. You presume that they left the project because they just didn't get the results that they want, which is usually the case. But results that they want might not necessarily mean bad results. Like many times it could have been they needed to get a kind of result that was going to allow them to finance maybe the next move on the property, and they had to make a decision on that because maybe the property was optioned from a fellow or something like that. And the choice was to let the property go, or basically commit to paying more money than they basically had, or whatever. And you can sort of fill in the details sometimes by looking at Cedar, but I don't think it really goes back. And Cedar, I don't know how far back it goes back, but 97, which covers the time. Yeah. So Cedar's not bad. That's a good idea. Other ones, historical archives, like if you've got ability to just like really data mine, big data, kind of scan through other publications and stuff. If you can find a keyword that'll home in on things, you can get some information. We sort of got interested in a prospect as an example up in the Elk Lake area, and it came to my knowledge through the Mr. Friendly sort of thing there. But guy I met in Elk Lake said, gold mining. It's like, we got no gold mine back on our farm. The granddad said it was quite the diggings when they were like us. And it was like, geez, it's not even. There's no record of any mines back there. Let's go see it. We went back. Holy cow! There's quite the diggings back here. The shaft and big muck pile. They're sampling some hunks. We're getting like 7-8 grams off this muck pile. It's kind of like, well, what's known about this thing? They didn't know. And there's a real history that goes through that area. But the guys who own the property, they didn't know. They didn't know what happened. There's no record of it. But sort of going back through it, we ended up finding a number of articles that were going back to 1904, 1906, very promotional kind of disclosures that made it to the the equivalent of the local Toronto Star or something at that time. But describing exactly this thing and the guys that were involved and what they thought and what they were doing, and it's really filled in a lot of the gaps. But it's certainly not in the common sort of source that you might find online. Yeah. So that's what
Are there any questions from online or from the people here?
That I don't know, because I'm not
a little speech thing.
Cato still has no girlfriend.
Okay.
That's okay, Cato. Yeah.
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 What's your role? Are you more like doing the detective work, or are you like management?
Question is, what's my role in the process? Am I more the detective and in management? I guess basically both. Like our company is very small. It's not like we have a management department and these sorts of things. But within our group, I would say our company, everybody has their own sort of specializations. Like my own skills. Like I don't consider myself to be a leading edge, very strong academically sort of focused geoscientist. I am a geoscientist, but I'm more of a jack of all trades sort of guy. A lot of the projects that I got involved with and generate, tend to come from maybe more my networking and kind of thinking outside the box, maybe with other things. Whereas other people in our group, we got a fellow, Grant Moore, who is very good, very knowledgeable magmatic sulfides guy. Very organized. He's a much more of a data-driven sort of guy there. And from first principles, he'll build up some amazing project ideas and so on. That's what he keeps focused on. And it takes different skill sets, I think, in a project generative company to do it. But when we're a small company, you kind of have to your chief, president and bottle washer all at the same time sometimes. Yeah. And but ultimately, I love to get in the field and basically, get involved in the projects. But fortunately, you kind of have to kind of make sure the rest of the house is in order so that you can do it. Yeah. Sounds good. Well, thanks everybody.